If you like this kind of chilling tale, click the like button and subscribe to Nightmare Narratives for more true horror stories. Your support means the world to us and helps us bring you even more terrifying content. Get scared and we'll see you in the next video. I still remember the first time I stepped into the Hodgson's house in Enfield. It was a modest, semi-detached home, nestled quietly in a suburban street of London. At first glance, it seemed like any other home, with its brick facade and small, well-kept garden. But as soon as I crossed the threshold, I felt an undeniable chill in the air, as if the house itself was aware of my presence. Peggy Hodgson, a weary but kind-hearted woman, greeted me at the door. Her eyes were sunken, marked by sleepless nights and endless worry. She introduced me to her children, Margaret, a thoughtful girl of 14, Janet, an energetic 11-year-old with a mischievous smile, and the two younger boys, Johnny and Billy, who clung to their mother, visibly distressed by the unseen forces that plagued their home. The family had been experiencing unexplainable phenomena for weeks. It started with small, seemingly innocent events, doors creaking open on their own, lights flickering without reason. But soon, these occurrences escalated to something far more sinister. Peggy recounted the night when everything changed, her voice trembling as she spoke. It was late, around midnight, Peggy began, glancing nervously at Janet, who nodded in agreement. The girls were asleep in their room when they woke up to their beds shaking violently. It wasn't just a slight tremor, it was as if someone was lifting the beds and dropping them back down repeatedly. Margaret chimed in, her voice barely above a whisper. We screamed for Mom, but by the time she got there, it had stopped. We thought maybe it was a dream, but then it happened again the next night, and the night after that. I could see the fear etched in their faces as they relived those nights. Janet added, one night, we heard this awful, guttural voice coming from the corner of the room. It was saying things, terrible things. But there was no one there. Determined to get to the bottom of these disturbances, Peggy had initially dismissed them as pranks by her children. However, as the occurrences grew more violent and frequent, she realized something far more malevolent was at play. Seeking help, she reached out to her neighbors, one of whom was a staunch skeptic. Mr. Harris, the neighbor in question, had scoffed at the idea of a haunting. He offered to spend a night in the house to prove that there was a logical explanation for everything. I remember the look on Peggy's face when she recounted this part. He was so confident, she said, but that night, everything changed. The next morning, Mr. Harris was found on the front steps, pale and trembling, muttering incoherent words. His bravado had vanished, replaced by a profound fear that Peggy said she had never seen in him before. As I listened to their story, I felt a mix of skepticism and intrigue. I had heard of poltergeists before, but never had I encountered one myself. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a series of events that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the supernatural. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the Hodgson's living room. The atmosphere was tense, and I could sense the family's anxiety. Peggy and I sat on the worn sofa, while the children huddled close by, their eyes darting nervously around the room. It was as if they were expecting something, anything, to happen at any moment. It started suddenly. A faint, rhythmic tapping echoed from the walls. At first, I thought it might be the old pipes or the house settling. But then, the tapping grew louder and more deliberate, moving methodically from one wall to the next. Peggy shot me a look of sheer desperation, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrest. Janet, usually so full of life, was uncharacteristically quiet. Her wide eyes were fixed on the corner of the room, where an old armchair sat. Suddenly, the chair began to rock back and forth, slowly at first, then with increasing intensity. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched the impossible unfold before my eyes. Peggy's voice was barely a whisper. It's happening again, she said, her voice trembling. This is how it always starts. Margaret, the eldest, tried to remain calm for her younger siblings. It's okay, she said, though her voice betrayed her fear. It's just trying to scare us. The rocking chair abruptly stopped, and the room fell into an eerie silence. For a moment, it seemed as though whatever presence was there had left. But then, a series of loud bangs erupted from the ceiling, as if something, or someone, was stomping furiously above us. Johnny and Billy clung to Peggy, their small bodies shaking with fear. "Make it stop, Mom!" Johnny cried, tears streaming down his face. Just then, the lights flickered, casting strange, dancing shadows on the walls. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath forming in front of me. The oppressive feeling of dread was palpable, pressing down on all of us. In the midst of the chaos, a guttural voice emerged from the darkness. It spoke in a low, menacing tone, uttering words that none of us could understand. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating through the room. Janet's face contorted in terror as she pointed towards the hallway. "It's there," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's watching us." I turned to look, but saw nothing. The sense of being observed, however, was overwhelming. Peggy stood up, her maternal instincts kicking in despite the terror she felt. "We have to get out of here," she said, her voice firm. As we made our way to the front door, it slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. We were trapped. The realization hit us all at once, and panic set in. The guttural voice grew louder, mocking us, laughing at our fear. In that moment, I understood the full extent of the family's torment. This wasn't just a series of random, unexplainable events. It was a calculated assault by an unseen entity, intent on driving them to the brink of madness. And as I stood there, paralyzed by fear, I realized that the worst was yet to come. The Hodgson household had become a battleground. Night after night, the unseen force grew bolder, its attacks more relentless. We all lived in constant fear, dreading the sunset, knowing the darkness would bring fresh horrors. The family's once warm home was now a place of cold terror. It was around 2 a.m. on a particularly frigid night when the most violent event occurred. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of settling wood. Suddenly, Janet let out a blood-curdling scream from her room. We all rushed in to find her suspended mid-air, her body rigid and eyes wide with terror. She was being lifted by an invisible force, her limbs flailing helplessly. "Help her!" Peggy screamed, her voice breaking with desperation. We all tried to grab Janet, but it was as if an invisible barrier was preventing us from reaching her. The guttural voice returned, echoing through the room, mocking our efforts. "You cannot save her," it growled, sending shivers down my spine. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Janet was dropped onto her bed. She lay there, gasping for breath, tears streaming down her face. The room fell into a suffocating silence, broken only by her sobs. The manifestations didn't stop there. The next day, as we sat in the living room trying to comprehend the previous night's events, the furniture began to move again. This time, it was more aggressive. The sofa lifted off the ground, tilting us onto the floor. Chairs flew across the room, smashing into walls. The television turned on by itself, blaring static at full volume. Margaret tried to shield her younger brothers, but they were hysterical. "Make it stop! Make it stop!" Billy cried, his small frame shaking with fear. Desperate for answers, Peggy reached out to the Society for Psychical Research. Within days, Maurice Gross and Guy Lyon Playfair arrived, armed with equipment and a determination to uncover the truth. They set up cameras, audio recorders, and other devices throughout the house, hoping to capture evidence of the poltergeist. That night, the investigators stayed with us. The tension was palpable as we all huddled in the living room, waiting. The house seemed to sense their presence, growing eerily quiet. For a moment, it seemed as though the torment might end. But then, the guttural voice returned, louder and angrier than ever before. Maurice and Guy exchanged a glance, their skepticism giving way to genuine fear. The voice spoke directly to them, taunting and threatening. "You think you can stop me?" it snarled. "This is my home now." The investigators were visibly shaken, but they pressed on. They recorded everything, the voices, the moving objects, the unexplained cold spots. They even captured Janet speaking in the same guttural tone, her eyes glazed over as if possessed. Despite the mounting evidence, there were still skeptics who believed it was all a hoax. But after that night, I knew the truth. The Hodgson family was not alone in their home. They were at the mercy of a malevolent entity that fed on their fear and thrived on their suffering. We were all exhausted, both physically and mentally. Each night brought new horrors, each more terrifying than the last. And as we faced the entity's wrath together, I realized that escaping this nightmare would be far harder than I ever imagined. The arrival of Maurice Gross and Guy Lyon Playfair brought a flicker of hope to the Hodgson family. Armed with their equipment and years of experience, they seemed like our best chance to understand and maybe even banish the entity tormenting us. But as the days turned into nights, it became clear that this malevolent force was not going to give up easily. The investigators set up their devices in every room, recording every sound, every movement. We watched as they conducted their tests, hoping for some rational explanation, but deep down, we knew there was none. The house had a life of its own, and it was angry. One night, Maurice and Guy gathered us in the living room. They wanted to perform a seance, hoping to communicate directly with the entity. The atmosphere was tense as we all sat around the table, hands joined. The air was thick with anticipation and fear. "Is there anyone here with us?" Maurice called out, his voice steady but firm. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the temperature in the room plummeted. Our breath became visible in the icy air, and an oppressive feeling of dread settled over us. The table began to shake, and a low, guttural laugh filled the room. "Why are you here?" Guy asked, his voice trembling slightly. The voice responded, speaking through Janet, who was now in a trance-like state. "This is my home," she said, her voice deep and menacing. "You cannot make me leave." The investigators exchanged a worried glance. This was beyond anything they had encountered before. They continued to ask questions, and the entity revealed bits and pieces of its past. It claimed to be the spirit of a man who had lived in the area long before the Hodgson family moved in, someone who had met a violent end and was now seeking revenge. As the seance continued, more disturbing truths came to light. The house, it seemed, was built on the grounds of an old asylum, where many had suffered and died. The entity's anger was fueled by the residual pain and torment of those forgotten souls. The revelations were both horrifying and enlightening. We now understood that the entity was not just a random spirit, but one with a deep connection to the land and a profound sense of injustice. It fed off the fear and suffering of the living, perpetuating a cycle of terror. As the seance concluded, Janet collapsed onto the table, exhausted and pale. We helped her to bed, and Maurice and Guy stayed up late, reviewing their recordings and notes. The evidence they had gathered was compelling, but it also painted a grim picture. This was not a simple haunting, it was a deeply rooted malevolence that would not be easily dispelled. In the days that followed, the investigators tried various methods to cleanse the house, rituals, blessings, and even exorcisms. But each attempt seemed to provoke the entity further. Objects flew across rooms, doors slammed shut, and the guttural voice grew more threatening. Through it all, the Hodgson family clung to each other, their bond strengthened by the shared ordeal. Peggy's resilience was remarkable. Despite her fear, she remained determined to protect her children. Margaret, Johnny, and Billy took solace in each other, finding moments of normalcy amidst the chaos. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something crucial, some key to breaking the entity's hold on the house. The history of the asylum and the spirits trapped within its walls haunted my thoughts. I knew that until we could address the root of the malevolence, the Hodgson family would never find peace. The night of the final confrontation was like no other. The air was thick with tension and dread as we gathered in the living room. Maurice and Guy had decided that this would be our last attempt to rid the house of the malevolent entity. They believed that a powerful exorcism might be our only hope. The family huddled together, a mix of fear and determination in their eyes. The room was dimly lit by a few flickering candles. The investigators had set up their equipment, and the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Maurice began to recite prayers and incantations, his voice steady and resolute. The temperature in the room dropped dramatically, and we could see our breath in the cold air. As the exorcism continued, the house responded violently. Objects flew across the room, smashing into walls. The guttural voice filled the air, louder and angrier than ever before. "You cannot banish me," it roared. "This is my home." Janet, who had been at the center of the haunting, suddenly convulsed and began to levitate. Her eyes rolled back, and she spoke in that same, deep voice. "You will all suffer," she threatened. Peggy rushed to her daughter's side, tears streaming down her face. "Leave her alone," she cried. "Take me instead." The entity seemed to consider her words. Janet dropped to the floor, unconscious but alive. The voice shifted its attention to Peggy, taunting her, trying to break her spirit. But Peggy stood firm, her love for her children giving her strength. The intensity of the exorcism reached its peak. The walls shook, and the floor vibrated beneath our feet. Maurice and Guy continued their prayers, their voices rising above the chaos. I felt a strange mix of fear and hope, as if we were on the brink of something monumental. Then, there was a moment of silence. The entity let out a final, agonized scream before the room was plunged into an eerie calm. The oppressive presence that had filled the house seemed to lift, and the temperature began to rise. We all stood there, stunned and exhausted. Maurice and Guy checked on Janet, who slowly regained consciousness. Her eyes were filled with tears, but she seemed to be herself again. Peggy hugged her tightly, relief and love radiating from her. The investigators reviewed their recordings and declared that the exorcism had been successful. The entity, it seemed, had been driven away, at least for now. The house, once a place of terror, felt strangely peaceful. In the days that followed, the Hodgson family began to heal. The lingering fear and trauma would take time to fade, but there was a newfound sense of hope. They started to rebuild their lives, finding moments of joy and normalcy that had been stolen from them. I visited them often, offering support and friendship. The bond we had formed through the shared ordeal was strong. We spoke of the entity less and less, focusing instead on the future and the possibility of true peace. As I reflect on those harrowing months, I am struck by the resilience and courage of the Hodgson family. They faced unimaginable terror but emerged stronger, united by their love for one another. The Enfield house, with its dark history, had been a place of suffering, but it was also a testament to the power of human spirit and the unyielding fight against darkness.